Okay, welcome. We're just going to let people come in. So whilst people are coming into the room, I would just like to say welcome everybody to our fourth and final Amicus on Death Row series, and we are incredibly excited to round off with Time on Death Row. And we have some amazing speakers who Professor York will introduce in just a moment. But it is my job to remind you that we are using the hashtag Amicus on Death Row, all one word. And so do feel free to tweet. And if you guys missed it on Tuesday, post-session, there was some great discussions because we ran out of time and everyone was so engaged that the conversation then carried on onto Twitter for a bit, which was fabulous. So do tweet that hashtag and we will pick up questions there. But we do have a Q&A function on this webinar, so all participants are able to pop questions in. Ideally, own your questions, and we can pull you in to ask your own question as well, but there is an anonymous function if you need that. So I think everyone's here, so welcome to the final Amicus on Death Row sessions, and I'm going to pass over directly to Professor John York. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Margot. Welcome everybody. So this is the conclusion of our really engaging Amicus on Death Row series, and we began this series looking at the arts on death row, and we were treated to Dr. Paul Edmondson, who's the head of research at Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and his analysis of how the death penalty is engaged in Shakespeare. And then we had the wonderful Professor Luis Zapatero-Arreo, and he took us through just a really detailed analysis of Francesco Goya and Goya's imagery at the execution scene. And after that, we had a wonderful discussion with the Dean of Coventry and Dr. Manuel Carlo, who is the ambassador of Argentina to Italy, and they discussed the difference between the Catholic and the Anglican doctrines and how we can approach abolition within the Christian faith. Then on Tuesday, we had an engagement with healthcare professionals on death row. We had a brilliant discussion with Professor Deborah Deno and Dr. Joel Zivo, looking at the ethics and the science of lethal injection processes. And I will say this, that I feel like we've saved the best till last, though, in this stellar, wonderful cast. We have three amazing with us this evening. I'm just going to give a very short introduction because I think my first question allows them to speak to their bios. All of them have incredible bios, and but we're going to begin our session today with Professor William Shabazz, who's Professor of International Law at Middlesex University. For all of those who are working the death penalty, Bill is just a friend to everybody, but he's also one of the most incredible fonts of knowledge on the death penalty. And whether it's in the international arena or in its domestic application, Bill really is, in many ways, he's the father of all of these sources of knowledge, and we're so glad and so thankful to have Bill with us this evening. Then we had Dr. Rajiv Narayan. I'm so happy that we have Rajiv here today, who's a Director of Policy at the International Commission Against the Death Penalty. The International Commission has been so important with engaging the governments on perhaps trying to create a world without the death penalty, and also particularly we learned about the importance of their dialogues and their invitations with Pope Francis and their engagings with how the Catholic Church can promote abolition worldwide. And then we have Robin Conrad, who's Assistant Federal Defender of Alabama. Robin perhaps litigated one of the most famous cases on lethal injection in the United States that became famous world over. And I think it's fair to say that Robin shot to stardom during that case. And Robin is just incredible. We're going to learn a lot from Robin on the federal and state procedure and of the United States. But that is just the framework of what we're going to engage with this evening, because the subject that we're going to focus on is the subject of time and temporality. If we can look at time as that which we measure, we use that to measure the flow of our lives, and temporality in many ways, how we perceive time, time of passing, and how we psychologically engage with that. We're going to look at some of these themes this evening and of how they relate to the death penalty. I'd like to start off with a quote from Lord Roger. So in an article, A Time for Everything Under the Law, in the Law Quarterly Review in 2004, Lord Roger said that when he's adjudicating, he doesn't necessarily think that much about time, but when it's brought to his attention, he sees it everywhere. And I think that when it's brought to our attention, we can see more how time comes into play, but we don't really learn about time and the law at university. We don't really learn about the temporality and how it's applied. It's something that we've picked up. So my first question to the panelists this evening is in that vein. Can you recall the first occasion that you thought about time in your engagement with the death penalty? And what was it? I open it up.
Well, I'll jump in so we don't sit here in silence. Thank you so much. I'm really humbled to be here and to engage in this topic with all of you. So thanks again for inviting me. I have to say that I have thought more about time than I probably ever have in preparation for this discussion. And so I was thinking about, when did I think about time or thought about it? And I don't know that there was an awareness literally at the time, but in reflecting upon things that have happened in my experience as a death penalty attorney, and just so that the audience knows, I do only post-conviction work. So once somebody has already been sentenced to death, then I eventually will get their cases. So I'm usually involved in the last round of appeals. So for me, my goal has been to get more time, right? So from the attorney perspective, I am constantly wanting more time. Because why? Because time means your client's alive. The state cannot seek an execution warrant until we are done through with the federal habeas proceedings, which is where I come into play. And so, I mean, even from asking for an extension of time, right? Extending more time to write a brief, more time to do investigation, to ensure that my client's case is being fully and fairly presented. And I just assumed as a young baby lawyer a few decades ago that my clients would want that same thing, right? That they would see time in the same way that I saw time. That has not always been the case. And I have learned over the years that my clients often have a very different perception of time. And as I'm working diligently on their cases, they're languishing on death row, and the conditions on death row are awful, often in solitary confinement, the food, the healthcare, the violence, I mean, all of those things. And so their desire in thinking about time is they want to be done. They want to be off death row. And at times they think about what that means. It might mean, I just want my case to be over, right? And thinking about wanting to hurry up and get a decision. And so there's been a tension of time between me and wanting and needing more time to fairly and fully litigate the case, and then the clients who are just really battling and struggling with having to sit on death row as we're in the background doing all of the work. So I guess at this point, I don't know what that means overall, but it just really helped me realize that I have to be more aware about time as it comes to litigating and relating to the clients. And I understand, but I'm still going to keep fighting for their lives and do whatever I can to help their time on death row to pass in a more humane way as much as possible.
Great. Thank you, Robin. Bill or Rajiv?
Okay, I'll take I'll take the plunge. We did take a bit of time to start. Actually, I was, it goes down memory lane. So I think for me, I started in Amnesty International as their East Asia researcher. That was when it really struck me, the issue of the death penalty. And this was the case of Hakamada Iwao, who had been sentenced to death in 1968. And I started in Amnesty in 1999. So he'd well past 30 years. And it was very clear that there were problems in his case because the first, he was sentenced by 3 judges, a court of 3 judges. One of the judges actually was quit because he was convinced that Hakamada Iwao was innocent. But in Japan, it's particularly difficult because they do not give any date for your execution. You just woken up one morning and in a couple of hours you are, basically hanged. And so Hakamada Iwao had already spent all this time. And we fought basically to get DNA evidence to a lab, and the courts were not convinced. The prosecutors were not convinced. And it took a really long time. It was in 2008 and 2012. There were 2 tests which conclusively proved that the DNA in the evidence that the prosecution had provided, they did not have the blood of Hakamada Iwao. And so finally in 2014, the very first court, of course judges were different, finally released him, ordered a retrial. But the problem is the prosecutors still continued to pursue him. So he's still, there's still a trial going on, and he could be resentenced back to face the death penalty. And he's well into his 80s now. And so it's kind of, that was when the whole thing hit me, when I met his sister, who believed in him. And there had been some very difficult times because there were years when he would not communicate with her. He had problems with his mental health. And again, in Japan, it's what you would call, you're halfway between, life and death, in the sense you are in solitary confinement. You are only allowed to go out for an hour at best every day. And so this was one of the times, you look at time, wonder how long, he had been in. And it was quite, it was in the World Congress that it was in Japan that I finally met him when he was released. And it was emotional, but, for him, I was just another person. So there is this issue of, for us, it was a big thing. For him, I think he had been through something and he's still alive. So we have to see how it goes. From a political angle, it was Kim Dae-jung, the former president of South Korea, who had faced the death penalty in the early 80s. And he'd been saved of the death row. And when he was elected, more by surprise, actually the Korean government, they have a gap. He was elected in December 1997, and he took charge in 1998, February. And on 30th December, they carried out 23 executions in one day. And after that, there have been no executions in Korea. And one of the things we tried very hard with President Kim was to abolish the death penalty. He believed in it because he had faced the death penalty and just barely survived. But he had a minority government and he regretted a long time. But it was also the question of, he used to recall of how many friends he had lost. And it's a question of memory, something to do, a legacy which he could not fulfill.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. Thank you.
Oh, let me start with a poem, or with a bit of a poem. 6 weeks our guardsman walked the yard in a suit of shabby gray. His cricket cap was on his head and his step seemed light and gay. But I never saw a man who looked so wistfully at the day. Some of you will recognize that. It's from Oscar Wilde, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. It's one of the stanzas. And Wilde, of course, had been sent to Reading Gaol. I think he served 2 years there. He saw this famous guardsman being prepared for execution. And it's all about the wait for the execution. This was this was not death row by our modern day standards. This was death row that lasted a matter of weeks. And if my recollection is correct, it was even referred to in the famous Privy Council decision on death row, the Pratt and Morgan decision of the Privy Council of 1993. Which brings me really to where I first thought about time and the death penalty, which was with regard to the first great European Court of Human Rights case dealing with capital punishment, which was the Söring case. Söring versus the United Kingdom, with Germany as the intervener, because Söring was a German national. And Söring had been involved in a murder, apparently. I gather he still claims he's innocent, or at least he does now, although he pleaded guilty earlier. But Söring was involved in the murder of his girlfriend's parents in Virginia, managed to escape, got to flee the country, got to London, and there, of course, he was arrested. And the first issue, which he would have liked to try, and which Amnesty did, the late Nigel Rodley prepared the brief for Amnesty in the courts, as it went through the courts in the UK and then to the European Court, that the death penalty as such was contrary to the European Convention on Human Rights. But he couldn't swing that one. The famous Protocol number 6 actually created an obstacle to it, where the European Court said, well, you know, the states parties to the European Convention have decided that to abolish the death penalty, they do it by a protocol to the convention, and so it's not for us to do. It was kind of ironic that the protocol actually stood in the way of judicial abolition of the death penalty. And so the judges developed this theory of the abolition of the death row phenomenon. And although it had been, I think, discussed in US courts before and once in the European Commission, this was really the big case on the death row phenomenon. And the death row phenomenon, the idea was that the prolonged wait on death row was inhuman or degrading, according to the terms of the European Convention, or cruel, inhuman, and degrading, according to the other international instruments, treatment or punishment. There was a sense at the time, my recollection is, that there was something a bit contrived about it, that it was the judges were clearly, majority clearly were for abolition of the death penalty. They would have loved to have declared it, but they couldn't wrap their minds around the idea that that would jive with the European Convention on Human Rights. And so they created this theory. It had its own problems. If you go back and read the judgment, I mean, they talked about his suffering. That was the issue. It wasn't just the delay, but it was that poor Söring was going to suffer on death row. One of the things they said he would suffer from was homosexual abuse. I think they're embarrassed to read that phrase today, but that was 1989 when they wrote that in the judgment of the European Court. And so that was it was the great ruling, because they refused to extradite him. And the day after, the American government sent an undertaking that he would not be executed. As some of you may know, he was sent back to Virginia, served for many years there, and ultimately, I think 2 years ago or 1 year ago, was sent back to Germany. And I gather he must be, maybe he's watching this. He's free in Germany now, apparently. So that was the death row phenomenon in the European Court. But then it went to the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, which would have been expected to endorse that view. And yet the Human Rights Committee couldn't accept it. And they took the view that the death row phenomenon, I mean, they said the fact of waiting for a prolonged period of time for execution cannot be a violation of human rights, because if we were to insist on that, states would simply execute people more quickly. And so we have this strange situation. I mean, it's become largely academic now, but back in the 90s, you had the two great human rights monitoring institutions, the European Court of Human Rights from the Council of Europe and the Human Rights Committee from the UN, and they weren't aligned on this. They couldn't agree on it. And I recall in the middle of the 1990s, I was working on the second edition of my book on the abolition of the death penalty. And I was in touch with the people at the Human Rights Committee. And we had our fingers crossed that they were going to switch. And they almost did. They almost went a majority for just supporting what the European Court did, but they stood back from the brink. And they've never done it. Never, even today. If you ask the two courts, they're not aligned. So.
Can I chime in on that real quick?
Yeah, please.
Because
Yeah.
that's really interesting because I didn't know that background, but in the United States, there's a case which I don't remember when it's from. And I say a case, it was a dissent from, I think, Justice Stevens, called Lackey, Lackey. And we raise what we call lackey claims, where basically it's the same thing, that to carry out a death warrant and execution at this point in time would be cruel and unusual because the prisoner has languished on death row for so long. And I've kind of battled the same thing myself, where do I want to raise that claim? Because then the result is they'll just speed up the process, right? So it's this kind of one of these claims that you worry about raising, that it could have this effect again of speeding up the process, obviously not for the client who has already spent decades on death row, but for future clients. So,
You know, it's a very strange situation that this issue, which has been so central to the case law of the European Court of Human Rights in particular, has never actually been properly adjudicated by the US Supreme Court, which has done, one would think, every little minute detail of death penalty issues have been litigated by the US courts, but not this one. I think Lackey, wasn't it an application, what we would call an application for leave to appeal, or what you call cert, that they just refused to hear the case?
yeah, it was like a dissent from the denial of cert or something like that. Yeah, there's never been an opinion on it. And Justice Breyer had written on it as well in some of his, dissents.
Yeah, on these issues, on Lackey claims, Robbie, Knight versus Florida as well is a really informative one, isn't it? With Justice Thomas's reasoning in that, because he kind of dissects the time duration on death row in his opinion, basically saying that if you put in appeals, you're wasting time and of our ability for the doctrine of finality, our ability to make this process final. You defense lawyers are utilizing that as, and you're part of the problem. But then Justice Breyer says, well, no, the defense lawyers are there to maintain time, to maintain their ability to stay on death row, to stay alive, to raise all the pertinent issues. And what's very interesting about that is that it is two justices talking about duration and the legality of duration, and to what extent our use of time is a constitutional mechanism, which is really, really fascinating. Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you very much for those introductory comments. So my next question is, thinking about the death penalty, whether it's in the domestic setting or the international setting, what, in your opinion, are some of the important time features that we need to be aware of when we're thinking about the death penalty?
Okay, I'll go first on this one.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Bill.
Well, yeah, let me talk about, this is an international issue in a way. About 3 months ago, I went to Taiwan for a week. Taiwan, is outside the international human rights system in a way, because they're not a member state of the United Nations, and the UN even kind of keeps its distance. Taiwan is a bit toxic as far as the UN is concerned, even for the human rights mechanisms. So Taiwan has set up an unofficial, at the international level, monitoring system of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They prepare a report, like all of the states parties, and they have to have a committee like the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations that assesses their respect and that monitors the obligations. So they name a committee of international experts, and I was on it this year. So I was there in Taiwan, and we divided up the territory amongst the different members of the committee, and inevitably I got Article 6, which is the article in the covenant on the death penalty. So in the reports that we got from the Taiwan government, they said, we want to abolish the death penalty. It's our goal to abolish the death penalty, but be patient. This takes a lot of time. They said, we look at Europe. Look at Britain, look at France, look how long it took them to abolish the death penalty. They gave, I think, a couple of other examples, maybe Switzerland, I can't remember now, but they focused on Britain and France. And when I was given the floor, I said, you know, you haven't done your homework. Whoever wrote that little pathetic explanation for why you can't abolish the death penalty now, they haven't studied it. I said, in Britain, they had a royal commission on the death penalty in the 1950s, I think in 52 or 53, that just said the death penalty, it's important, it's valuable, we're going to keep it. And a dozen years later, they abolished it, just like that, basically. They gave it a 4-year trial period, but essentially it was abolished, and there have been no executions since. France had its last execution in 1978, I believe, and within 3 years, they did it. So they just weren't aware of how quickly this actually happens. There's a kind of a myth out there that this takes a long time and you have to be very patient. It's interesting that although Taiwan wants to kind of differentiate itself from the People's Republic of China as the human rights paradise, as opposed to People's Republic of China, I've been to China many times debating with people at the death penalty, about the death penalty. And we get the same argument. They say, yes, 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 we're going to do it. It just takes time. It just takes a long time. And so this, I think, you know, maybe it's not what you had in mind when we're talking about time and the death penalty, but it's this excuse that some countries give, not all of them, because there aren't many countries who execute, who are left. And some countries, like Saudi Arabia, and I think maybe even the parts of the United States that have the death penalty will just say, it's not a question of time, we're not going to abolish it, that's it. But some countries say we're going to abolish it, but it's a protracted business. But it shouldn't be, and they should check the history, because many, many countries just do it like that. They take a decision and they move on. And so there.
Bill, it's really interesting. Can I just ask you a question, just from your experiences, not just in the Taiwan Committee, but in your vast experience of working in the UN? So in Article 6, subsection 6 of the ICCPR, says nothing in this article shall be invoked to delay or prevent the abolition of capital punishment. Have you had any dialogue with any of the governments on that word delay?
You know, it's not on the word. I mean, the idea that it's this idea that the recognition of the death penalty in Article 6 of the Covenant, which is essentially, it's about fundamental rights, Article 6. The whole covenant is about rights. And so it's bizarre that they have a detailed discussion of the exceptions to a fundamental right, which is the right to life. And so Article 6 is there saying, don't emphasize that. Don't get carried away thinking that this is a license to execute. Nevertheless, some states do it. Singapore and others say, look at Article 6, paragraph 2. The covenant recognizes the death penalty. But it's clear when you read it all together, and you have to take into account paragraph 6, that this is really, it's about the recognition of an exception. What's unusual about it is that it's an exception that is temporary, that there's a pejorative notion about it. We have exceptions elsewhere. For example, when we say freedom of expression is subject to exceptions like hate speech or propaganda for war. And those are, I don't want to say they're benign, they're progressive. They're important limitations on the right because they're about other rights and about other principles. And it's not the case with the death penalty, obviously. But yeah, it's having that in the covenant in some ways has done a lot of harm over the years because it's been invoked by states. And the paragraph 6 that you referred to hasn't been effective enough, I think, over the years in knocking out that argument.
Thank you, Bill. Rajiv and Robin, then same question. Yes. What do you think today? What do we need to focus on today with regards to time in the death penalty?
I think I'll give you the example of Kazakhstan, which has recently abolished the death penalty. Kazakhstan actually had not abolished the death penalty, but they have been a founding member of the support group of International Commission Against Death Penalty. And actually, in 2016, 2017, they actually expanded the scope of the death penalty. So we raised concerns. And in 2018, they asked us for help. And then, there was not much exchange. But 2019, we thought, okay, let's take the initiatives. So we organized a meeting of Geneva-based permanent representatives of Central Asia plus Mongolia. And since Mongolia had abolished the death penalty, they hosted it. And this was also because it was similar to the nuclear weapons treaty that these 6 countries have. So we thought this would be the next one. And the idea was not to focus just on one country. And so Kazakhstan, actually the very next month, in December 2019, the President Tokayev said that he was for abolishing the death penalty by becoming a state signatory to the second optional protocol to ICCPR. And so we then interacted with them. Then COVID came in the way. But still in September 2019, they became a state signatory. And we were pushing them to ratify because one of our commissioners, Mark Bossiut, is the drafter of the second optional protocol. So he was very keen to get them to become, one of the countries immediately ratifying, making international commitment, like Mongolia. But they said, no, we are going to change amend the laws. And so we kept pressure, and it was in November 2021, we met with their representatives, the diplomats in Geneva, and they said actually when they became state signatory to the second optional protocol, they kept the death penalty during times of war. But the president decided that they would actually go and abolish the death penalty unconditionally and at all times. And so in December, they passed the bill in the parliament, and he signed the bill on 29th of December, 2021. And then we pushed for ratification of the second optional protocol. They did in March. And now, and they have also now incorporated the abolition of the death penalty into the constitution in June. So in this case, it's a question of, as Bill was saying, it takes political leadership at one level. And it also helps that, Kazakhstan is a member of the Human Rights Committee. They want to show it's, some good things that they're doing on human rights. And in a way, but there's also the question of time. We had to keep the momentum. And we find in some countries, it's when you have the end of an authoritarian regime. Say, for example, Spain, where I'm based, the abolition of the penalty, like many of the human rights, came after the Franco regime because they said this was enough. Too many people had been executed. And this was one of the ways to move towards democracy in all senses of the term, but also make it, consolidate the democracy by also deepening human rights. And so you find in other countries, it's like East Timor, or you find Rwanda, for example, where the international tribunals have also played a role. But you find that this was a time of a conflict with a lot of loss of life, a lot of suffering. And they felt that this was, abolition was one of the ways to differentiate, to move away from a time of great bloodshed. Of course, that also saved the lives of those who have been found guilty of crimes against humanity. But it is also the question of the timing.
Thank you, Rajiv. Robin?
Yeah, so I think what I was going to say in thinking about this has completely shifted based on hearing the comments from Bill and Rajiv, but I think that, I have a perspective from a much more micro level. And, I have heard many people say it takes time, because I'm like, why can't we, do this now or get this done? And it's like, people keep talking about in the United States chipping away at the death penalty and, inching and getting a little bit at a time and small wins and thinking about time and how, what's the right time? When I was involved in the case Glossop versus Gross, which was the name in the United States Supreme Court, but was not the name in the courts below, because there was another gentleman, Charles Warner, who was the named plaintiff, who the Supreme Court allowed his execution to go forward and then granted certiorari in that case. But I remember thinking, in 2014, there were several botched executions that happened at the beginning of 2014. In January, Dennis McGuire in Ohio was injected with a drug called midazolam, and those of you who participated on Tuesday heard Dr. Zivit talking a lot about that drug, and it was a very awful, from a witness perspective, outwardly view of the Mr. McGuire gasping for air. And then in April of 2014, you had the execution of Clayton Lockett in Oklahoma, which, gained international attention because he was jolted out of consciousness. Again, thinking about time and consciousness, he was, being executed, woke up, started writhing in pain, so much so that they closed the curtains, and he eventually died. And then in July of 2014 in Arizona, one of my clients, Joseph Wood, took almost 2 hours to be executed, where he gasped for breath. It's so long, so much so that we had an emergency hearing in front of a judge during his execution to ask the judge to intervene and stay his execution and, basically have life-saving measures to stop this execution. That did not happen, and he eventually died. But all this was going on in 2014 while we were handling the prisoners who were up for execution in Oklahoma, including Richard Glossop. And so I thought to myself, again, a younger attorney, still just like a little naive, to say the least, very much in my head saying, if this is a case that the Supreme Court's ready to do something about lethal injection, about this drug, about, the death penalty at large, it's going to be this case, right? We had it was the right time. It was the right setting with these horrible executions that had taken place, all of the attention, everything going on. And so we set that up and thought, if they're not going to take this case, what case will they? Now, of course, they ended up taking it, and we had a bad outcome. But I remember talking to people in preparation for the argument and briefing that there were people much older and wiser than I that said, there might be some push from the justices about, is it time to end the death penalty from, the court's perspective. I, of course, as the attorney for the prisoners, that argument would not have gone over well, because then, the whole theme of the state was that this case wasn't truly about challenging a drug protocol, but it was about a bigger picture of abolitionists just trying to end the death penalty. And this was a backdoor window that they were trying to make that happen. So my answer when I was asked by Justice Breyer of, aren't we at the point that maybe the death penalty is unconstitutional given everything, was, of course, that issue is not before this court. Not surprisingly, Justice Alito jumped down my throat after that. Well, this is, that's why you're here. It's a guerrilla war against the death penalty. But just thinking about that, I guess, again, this perspective of, does it take time? Can we do it like this? And really, if 5 justices wanted to join the dissent that Breyer and Ginsburg wrote, they could have, and we would have ended the death penalty, at least for that time. I don't think that the current Supreme Court would have let that holding stand. But anyway, that's my reflection.
But your case, Robin, is fascinating, and it also brings to the question of what happens in the body. I know you litigated this a lot. What happens internally? So these drugs mask externally the pain and suffering that's happening internally, and we don't really know what happened internally, as Dr. Zivo said on Tuesday, until an autopsy occurs. So we have to find out what happens in the organs. I find that quite fascinating, because we're in the realm of Schrodinger, Schrodinger's cat kind of world in the courtroom. Is there pain? Is there insufficient pain? Is there not? Is it constitutional? Is there not? You only actually know after the death. It's something which cannot be determined at that time. It's kind of called lethal injection in many ways. It causes a paradox when it's viewed through the time lens. If we think about, we're not able to see the constitutional parameters as the death occurs, but it's only afterwards that constitutionally. But then Justice Stevens says, I think it was in his Lackey dissent, that you can't then correct the death. You know, you can't correct the miscarriage of justice once it's occurred. And and it seems that a time lens would perhaps cause more problems than it would be valuable, I think, for the justices. But it's interesting how lethal injection has made time analysis quite problematical in that context.
Yeah, and no, it certainly has. And I think just thinking about that we have to wait until afterwards to see if the person was tortured to death. But even still, when there were people who were waking up or gasping for breath, it was almost like, well, we're going to say that wasn't torture, that, you know, there wasn't any level of consciousness on the prisoner's behalf. This was just involuntary movement, involuntary snoring, which I don't, you know, I'm obviously not a doctor, but the medical professionals that I have consulted with have said, you know, that's not accurate. And there's no way to know the level of consciousness that the person who was being executed at that time was experiencing and feeling the pain.
So the next question that I have, in your understanding of in the death penalty and the use of time, I think actually you've all touched upon the differences in the death row phenomenon litigation, comparing that to the Lackey litigation. But can you think of any other examples where domestic courts on time on the death penalty have viewed this subject differently to the international courts? In your knowledge, have you come across anything there? One example that I can think of is in the Telugu's versus United States case in the Inter-American Commission Court of Human Rights, and in 2014, 2017. The British government filed amici curiae in Linda Carty's case in Texas, and in these cases it demonstrated that there have been two observations of constitutional deficiencies in her case. One was prosecutorial misconduct, the other one was ineffective assistance of counsel. But these were determined in two different courts at two different appeal levels. And the British government said that we should have this what's called a cumulative review. So you take those two sections of time in the case, bring them together, and under a cumulative review, putting them together in one judicial analysis would then elevate it to go past the threshold of the Eighth Amendment. But if you separate them though, and you review them in two separate litigatable time periods, you can water down their constitutional deficiency. So we brought this to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court didn't grant cert in this case. But in the Inter-American Court, they said yes, it actually is a violation of the right to a fair trial to keep these issues separate if together in the cumulative review, that we can therefore establish a violation of international law in that context. So there's a comparison there of domestic with international review. You can't think of any other example. It's a bit of a tricky one, a complex one. Yeah, okay. Are there, so thinking of just like your general knowledge, I know that this is quite a niche subject, but you're all world experts. Thinking of your different understandings of time. So if we think time as linear, or time as branchable, or time as being heavy sometimes and light other times, can you think of any other, or maybe timekeeping? Can you think of any other examples in the death penalty that you think might raise issues that are justiciable to help defendants on death row or in capital trials?
Yeah, let me take that. So one of the issues we've been recently dealing with is, on children and youth and the death penalty. And so, there is, of course, with the ICCPR Article 6.5 and also with the rights of the child, Convention on the Rights of the Child, if, the executions of those below the age of 18 is prohibited. And that is accepted by most countries. But then you still have some countries continuing carrying out executions. And one of the reasons they say is age determination. It's very difficult to determine the age of the person, and actually it's quite easy if you have a register, if you have, so you've actually had cases where now we have to go into the aid agencies to give them education to the law enforcement authorities, so that there is a registration system for births, so that it can then be conclusively proved. But many of these countries where they are carrying out these executions, not many, fortunately, still there are a few, this is a very strong argument. The other one, of course, is the at what stage, if you are below 18 at the time of the crime, but the case comes up much later. So by the time you're above the age of 18, and that is also used against the person. And in some cases, we've also heard, oh, that person was evil. I remember in this very famous case in India where a young woman was sexually assaulted. She had grievous injuries in a bus, and this was in Delhi, in South Delhi. And she died subsequently. And the masterminds was someone who was below the age of 18. And the others actually now, there were 5, if I'm not mistaken, of which but this particular gentleman, or rather young man at that time, he was, he served 3 years and he was released. And a lot of people were very upset. In fact, that set the whole trend to, it was known as the Nirbhaya case. Nirbhaya means fearless. That was the name given to the woman whose name was not, made public at that time. And so the other one of them was killed in a prison, and 4 others were last who were executed 2 years ago in India. And not sympathy for them, but the question of time comes in with this issue. The other part is the other way, which came as a surprise when we had visits to Belarus, and I remember we had gone with a parliamentarian. And Belarus is, as you know, the only European country that still carries out executions. It's very secretive. But in the course, he mentioned to us that actually this was in front of students, because this is a part of advocacy to students. He said that there are no executions for people above the age of 70 in Belarus. And so I asked him, how old are you? He said, oh, I'm in my mid-60s. I said, and he also said there are no executions for children below the age of 18 and for women. So I said, well, he and I were basically in danger of facing the death penalty because we were below in that category between 18 and 70, and also, male. And so he was not very happy with it. And so he said something in, Belarusian, which later I was told was a bad word. But anyway, but the students didn't know that there were these exemptions. Another country which I've come across is China, where apparently in 2011, they have exempted those above the age of 75, from execution. And I also heard the story about Saddam Hussein, who was executed. And one of the reasons he was executed was because I think very shortly after he was going to be 70 and thereby exempt from the death penalty in Iraq. And so, you have the question of time coming in all these varying examples.
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. Absolutely, yeah. So too young or too old, and so the biological arrow of time in human beings, and that's absolutely fascinating. In your commission, are you doing any? Because obviously, with the development of neuroscience and the development of cognitive understanding of basically of mental maturity vis-a-vis physical maturity, and so it's. The age of 18 is just an arbitrary number. People can be more mature, younger, or less mature, even older. Is the commission doing any work on this at all?
Yes, we're quite fortunate because one of our commissioners, her name is Martha Santos Pais, is the former UN Secretary General's special representative on violence against children till last year. So So she brings a wealth of knowledge. She's also contributed in the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And also, recently she told us she was also involved in the drafting of the second optional protocol. So to the ICCPR. So we've recently been working. We had a side event at the UN on children, youth, and the death penalty. And we're using it in different ways because it's not just the juvenile offenders aspect. There's also the aspect of their children, the young people being, when I say young, it's we can stretch it to the age of 34. And here it's also them being members of families who have persons facing the death penalty and also being executed, because then they become victims by association or by relation through no fault of theirs. But then they have an economic loss, a social loss, a psychological loss. But often they're found to be just as guilty, even though they've not committed a crime. I remember this case in Japan. There's this OM group, which really set back the whole death penalty. This was in 1995. They carried out the sarin gas attack in the metro, and there were a few people killed, thousands injured, and that turned the debate. But still, at that point, Japan, there was a definite abolitionist trend. They were moving towards abolition. But this particular incident changed completely the whole perspective, and now they still carry out execution. And in this case, the head of the OM group, his kid, 2 daughters, who unfortunately looked like him. And so they were bullied in school, they were beaten, and it came to a point where they had to leave the country because they had become victims because of the father's. And again, his was a case of mental illness, which was never explored. And he was one of the 14 who were executed, I think, 2 years ago by Japan. And it shows the arbitrariness in the system there. But there's a time, it's like, it's a file. They had this case, they got all the people they wanted to close it. So they carried out executions, I think, in 2 separate sets. But yes, but coming back, we are doing work on this issue, but we'll have to see how to bring it out.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Robin, if I can ask you a question, but obviously Bill and please feel free to answer. So the future dangerousness. So we're looking into the future, not something that's happening now, of a jury's assessment of a capital defendant. And obviously we know, so Leo Tolstoy in his book The Resurrection, he famously stated that we should never judge a person by the worst thing they've ever done in that path. That's the greatest form of inhumanity. And it kind of helps me to think of the Minority Report, those precogs, and the police come and arrest the person before they've committed the crime, so they don't commit the crime. And of course, we know what Philip K. Dick teaches us about that. But I was thinking the capital justice system of the United States, it asks that those decision makers to be kind of time lords, to project themselves into the future, to see what somebody might do in the future. And when we think of free will and our understanding of the past. So if the past is closed, so if time is a branchable concept, and when we've lived a certain branch, we break off the branches of the past, and only the future can fork. We can go either one way or the other. We can make the decision to be a good person or make the decision not to be a good person. But that's always open. It's an open future. To what extent do you think in the United States there's a big unfairness with future dangerousness assessment, because it seems to be couched towards bringing death sentences rather than allowing mitigating factors to preserve someone's life?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And future dangerousness is a aggravating circumstance in some jurisdictions, and Texas requires it as part of the analysis. Not all jurisdictions luckily require it or have it as an option. But it's always been one of those things that just absolutely infuriates me that it could be used. Obviously we saw it being used in a racist way in Texas, with the Buck case a few years back. This judgment that people who, the darker their skin, the more likely they are to be a future danger. And I think that's a true perception for a lot of people in this country. Due, obviously to the history, but also to media's portrayal of what a criminal looks like, and so you have jurors deciding, whether somebody, like you said, is going to commit this possible future danger, and it's all based on past behavior. And oftentimes they're allowed to bring in evidence not just related to the capital crime, but any prior history of violence that they may have had, whether it be in the institutional setting or before that. And I have seen, I know it's not allowed, but I have seen people try to use like juvenile history of crime. And I say it's not allowed, it shouldn't be allowed. But of course, judges make decisions and things are allowed. And so the fact that, just taking it back to the age, like what Rajiv was saying, is that you're now saying this person's going to be a future danger because they were a bad kid, if you will, or committed some acts as a juvenile, without looking really at this idea that people are redeemable, that there's some level of redemption, which has always fascinated me, because, so many people in our country are, or call themselves Christians, which, this idea of redemption and everybody sins and we can be forgiven for our sins, but it doesn't always seem to roll over into death penalty and jury sentencing, which again, I can't really wrap my mind around that. Admittedly, I am not of the Christian faith and wasn't raised that way. So what I know about it is just very limited, from probably more academic and just talking to people. But I think you raised this, it's a great point that how can we, go ahead and sentence people to death based on what we believe their behavior is going to be in the future, as opposed to, not that I'm advocating this, but perhaps say, well, we're not sure, but if you commit so many crimes in jail, then you're going to or in prison, get an automatic death sentence. Obviously I would never want that, but that to me at least is some level of like, we're not going to be judging you on behavior that hasn't even existed.
Thank you, Robin. Rajiv, build. Oh, yeah.
Let me just see if I can contribute something useful to this discussion. I've often lectured about capital punishment, where I produce a graph on a screen, on a PowerPoint presentation, and one of the axes of the graph is about time. It's the years. Usually it starts around 1950 and it goes to the present day. And it's a graph, you can see it, I've reproduced it in the quinquennial reports of the Secretary General on a few occasions. And it shows the progress of abolition of the death penalty globally, which is, just an incredibly dramatic story over time. We're looking at time and seeing what's happening to this phenomenon, and to what is, of course, in the tension with this phenomenon, which is the human right to life. It's hard to do with a lot of human rights. I'd love to be able to do a graph about the human right of women's equality. I expect it looks rather like the death penalty. If we knew how to measure it more accurately, I'd like to do the human right to torture. I'm less certain about that, or the human right to protection against enforced disappearance. When there's the death penalty, we have a lot of numbers. It's relatively easy to quantify because we can look, for example, at things like the number of states that have, we can look at how many have abolished the death penalty in law, and that gives us one dimension of this. And we can look at how many states have stopped using the death penalty, which means we add the ones to the ones who've stopped using it in law. We add the ones who stopped using it in practice, which I think is a very meaningful statistic. And it's also very clear over the years that the ones who stopped using it, whether it's by law or in practice, almost never return. We have a few examples of states that have abolished it in law, maybe one, the Philippines. We had one last week of one that had abolished it in practice, Myanmar, and they've returned to it. But basically, this is going almost exclusively in one direction, looking at it over time. We focused a lot. I mean, it's the United States has always been the focus of so much discussion about this, because we have so much information from the United States. We have so many great lawyers fighting the death penalty, academics working on it. But really, the US is down to, what, a dozen executions a year, more or less? I think they've done 7 this year. And there are maybe another 10 scheduled, but probably some of those.
I was going to say Alabama has an execution scheduled in 5 hours.
Yeah, well, you're in a bad state, Robin, you know that. But, you know, you have 50 to choose from, and, you know, you drew the short straw. You're in one of about, what, half a dozen now that are actually still conducting capital punishment, and the rest of them, it's kind of stopped. And that's the case for most of the world. So one of our problems, of course, in trying to understand and analyze and figure out how to fight this is that we're down to so few countries doing it that you almost can't generalize anymore. You can't say, well, we should do this campaign with all these countries or that campaign. I mean, what are we going to do? Go to Vermont and campaign against the death penalty? In the United States, there are half a dozen states who are doing it. We have to figure out ways to deal with it there. And even in those states, it's only some counties, I think. I think in Texas, isn't it down to a handful of counties in all of Texas that are doing this? So that's part of the problem. You know, we talked a little bit at the very beginning about death row and the death row phenomenon. This is it's a problem in all of these countries that have largely stopped using the death penalty or stopped altogether, but haven't abolished it, because they either have people on death row or they continue to sentence people to death, but they don't carry it out. The United States is almost in that category, not quite, but almost, because I don't know how many people get sentenced to death every year in the US, but there are currently about somewhere around 2,500 people on death row in the United States. And if you're executing them at the rate of about 12 a year, it's going to take you 200 years to execute them all. And obviously that's not going to happen. So most of the people, the vast majority of people who are sentenced to death in the US, it doesn't look like they're ever going to be executed. They're going to die on death row, or maybe some of them will be released, but that's not going to happen. And, you know, it raises another issue, which is always important in the campaign against capital punishment, is what do we do about the alternatives? And often, to win the argument about the death penalty, we say, well, we'll have life without parole. And people say, but that would be an inhumane punishment as well. But frankly, life without parole is an inhumane punishment. There's no doubt about that. And those 2,600 people on death row in the US, in practice, most of them, that's what they're sentenced to, is life without parole. They'll never be executed, but most of them will never be released either, I suspect. So this is the problem we live with, and that's about time as well. And it's about, you know, is it just as bad to have somebody sit in a cell for years and years and years? Because that's also about time, and that's about cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment as well. I don't know the answer to all of this. And, you know, we're also, because my field really, I see people like Robin and Rajiv, who are kind of more in the trenches fighting these issues. And I'm, you know, in the university library studying the figures and looking at articles on this. But I work with the human rights instruments. And we're also living in the past there, because we have human rights treaties with these archaic provisions that were adopted at a time when the death penalty was kind of widely accepted and widely used. And, you know, on the one hand, it's a positive thing to look at it and say, you see where we were and where we are now. Isn't that great? But I like to think that we're watching the death throes of capital punishment. I believe we are. But is it a matter of 10 years or is it a matter of 50 years or whatever? I thought not long ago that we were on the cusp of the US Supreme Court being ready to declare judicial abolition. But it's probably Robin will confirm this, a more reactionary institution than it used to be. And that doesn't appear to be, here's time again. We have too many young people on the US Supreme Court. So.
Thank you very much, Bill. We've got some questions from the audience. I'll try and get through some of them. This one speaks to, I think, the points that Rajiv has been making, but it's for everyone. What are your thoughts on states' response to the aging prison population? And Bill touched upon this as well just now, particularly the execution of patients with dementia. Do you think the argument cruel punishment is more or less relevant here, given that the afflicted individual may have little or no concept of time versus their former selves? Question from an anonymous attendee.
Well, there are
your mic's off, Bill.
I mean, there are rules, I think, in customary international law against executing people who are not mentally competent. And this is widely accepted. I mean, I don't think that judges in the United States would disagree with the idea that you can't execute somebody who doesn't know what's happening to them. The issue there is simply, there are issues like, can you drug them up so that you can, get them up to a level where they can be executed or not? Those types of questions. But yeah, I mean, the idea, it was Rajiv who mentioned these strange rules that you had in Belarus. But I think it's characteristic of all of the former Soviet or Soviet influenced states about these prohibitions on the death penalty for women and for older persons. And they're interesting to reflect on. We also have the prohibition on the execution of older persons in the American Convention on Human Rights. But it's different than, we do the age limit for children, juveniles, we say 18. It's a bit arbitrary, could be 21, could be 17, but that's the number we've got. So it's 18, and it's based on the idea that prior to that, there's kind of a level of immaturity that makes it inappropriate to make people pay the supreme penalty for the consequences of what they've done. But obviously that doesn't apply when you're older. Obviously that's irrelevant to the issue when you're 70 years old. And the prohibition of being over 70, it's about, and it's not even about when the crime was committed. I think it's a prohibition. It's an absolute, if you make it to 70, you're in the clear. And it's not about having committed the crime. When you committed the crime, it's about the age you're at. These are kind of strange and they're not all logical. They don't all make sense, but they're all actually attempts to bring humanity to bear on a penalty that's inhumane.
Yeah, and when Rajiv was saying how there's the limit of if you're older than 70, I thought, well, gosh, I wish we had that here, because we do have such an aging population, as the attendee had noted, and the states are not afraid to carry out executions of the elderly, and they, those arguments have been lost to try to prevent executions from going forward. Arizona carried out a couple executions in the past few months of elderly individuals, Mr. Atwood and Mr. Dixon. I used to work in the office where Mr. Dixon, was represented, and he was in a wheelchair, being brought up in a wheelchair to the visiting yard, was blind, and that was, probably 7-8 years ago. I can't imagine it has gotten better. So this idea that we're wheeling people into the execution chamber, that's literally what's happening. I wish that we could have some level of, okay, enough's enough. Let these people die. in prison, or I mean, honestly, they're not a danger. I would hope that they could just let them out and live the last, months or years of their life with their family. And honestly, it would save the state a lot of money, because they're paying for healthcare of the elderly. But of course, the difference between youth is the state will necessarily argue, what Justice Thomas argued, that they're causing these delays because they're, basically exercising their rights to appeal their decision. And so if they've been on death row for 30 years, it's their fault. They could have been executed when they were younger and healthy.
On the mental health part, I mean, I remember we recently had a long campaign to prevent the execution in Singapore of Nagendran. And he, again, there were a lot of, medical evidence that he didn't know where he was. He was like, he thought like a child. In fact, he thought he was going to his mother's when he was, about to be executed. And the execution was postponed 4 times, I think, due to international attention. But eventually the Singapore authorities said enough is enough, and they carried out his execution, I think, a couple of months ago. But there they just dismissed the mental health issue, saying he should have known better. And the judge, I think, made the argument that he knew that he was carrying these drugs, and that he would be paying a heavy price if he was caught, and that he was there to make money. So it's one of those difficult areas where you think, as Bill was saying, these are difficult countries, and we have to tailor-made how to, look at this narrative and build a counter narrative. I think there was a case, Robin, I think there was a case of Mr. Harm, I think, who, I think they couldn't find the vein, and they tried to execute him. He had cancer, and I think they couldn't find the vein, and I think the hour past midnight. And so he was, the execution was stopped, and then he died last year, I think, of cancer. Yeah. But again, in death row. So yeah, you make a good point, Bill, about the above 70 category. And there is an argument, about what should, again, in China, it's 75. In some countries, especially the former Soviet bloc countries, it's 70. I mean, it's a difficult argument. But I think coming back to countries like Singapore or even China, or you find in many African countries too, we find the thread coming to your argument. I think every time there is a human rights moratorium resolution, which we're coming into one now, later this year, you find the issue of national sovereignty coming to play. And one of the reasons is that these countries argue that the death penalty is a part of the penal code. And so hence it is up to each country to decide, how to move forward. So they try to remove the human rights aspect. So the human rights aspects would include, competence to face the death penalty, physically or mentally, the age aspect, because it's basically that you've committed the crime. These crimes are there in the penal code, and they have to face the death penalty. And you find the strange phenomena now in many countries in Africa, where actually this is the continent where many countries are now abolishing the death penalty, but they support the sovereignty amendment, which weakens the resolution. And it's something where we have to see, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Because since the sovereignty amendment has come in, more countries have actually supported the resolution, but it is a weaker resolution. And then you have cases of many countries who have, led to this sovereignty amendment being there and voting against amended resolution. So it's a double blow. And so there, which comes to the next point, which is populism. You have this, increased, populist authoritarian leaders who like the death penalty for some reason, kind of builds the strongman image. Most of them are men, and the death penalty plays into this power game. I mean, at one level, I'm told that in the Philippines, since Mr. Duterte is no longer the president, his daughter is, but I'm told, is different. And now we have the young Marcos, who's the president. And I'm told that he's more internationally aware, and there is less possibility for them reinstating the death penalty. But still, there is a danger. And then there is the other part of extrajudicial executions too, which police authorities carry out with great impunity. So these are some of the dangers. I remember also in California, there was the referendum vote some years ago, where I think the police associations brought the issue saying there were too many people facing the death penalty in California because they had not carried out an execution for over 20 years, and we have more than 700. And so they should expedite. And I think a judge had made a ruling that if you've been in prison for a long period of time, it constitutes cruel, inhuman, it constitutes cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. But he basically wanted to expedite the executions. So in a sense, we do find with Governor Newsom, he's brought a moratorium and he's dismantled the execution chamber. But is that enough? I mean, to go for the commutation part, 700 plus commutations is a tall order. So we do have these various questions coming in. And again, all related to a particular time where globalization is facing a big threat. So I see the death penalty phenomena as part of the globalization drive. And there are questions there.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. So a lot of our questions have been looking at the state's use of time in putting people to death, and the defendant actually wants to continue their life, so continue time. But we have an interesting question from another anonymous attendee, that what words of encouragement, so this is a volunteer for execution question, what words of encouragement or inspiration would you give an inmate on death row who would rather be executed than to remain in prison until their natural death?
I can take a stab at that because I've had to do that many a time. And it's an excellent question. And I think it's one where, honestly, it ebbs and flows based on how I'm feeling as the lawyer as well, because I have to make sure I'm maintaining hope. And I have to tell you, I've been a little bit unhopeful given the recent changes to our Supreme Court and just the politics in the United States of late. But what I've tried to do is figure out what sparks that person, right? We're all different. Everybody has their ups and downs in life, and when I think about what is it going to be that's going to help this person want to live, right? And it's unique to every individual. And I just want to have a quick shout out to Beth McGowitt, who is a dear friend of mine. She has been a member of Lifelines and has written death row prisoners here. And we met through one of my clients who has since been executed. But I know she was with him for 19 years, just giving him the support that he needed to have connection with people. And I think that's one of the biggest themes that I've seen over the years, is that when people lose some connection, whether it's, the loss of a family member, whether it's, just maybe a breakup or something, that's when people lose hope, right? And they want to give up their appeals and want to rush to an execution. So for those of you who are interested in keeping a pen pal on death row, I highly suggest that, because there's just no other way that I think is a good way, other than making sure people feel connected to someone and feel like they have some level of purpose and that somebody cares about them.
Thank you so much, Robin. Rajiv or Bill, do you want to say anything about that question? Okay. Right, in the audience, we have Sonny Jacobs, and her and her husband, Peter Pringle, they were both sentenced to death, and they both were exonerated. And what's very interesting in both of their biographical stories, they both indicate the importance of time. Sonny would like to make a comment, and she'd like to make a comment verbally. So I believe Sonny's in the audience. Yep, your hand is raised. Please, you have the floor, Sonny.
Hello. Hi, I asked Peter to come in too. Can you see us?
No, your camera's not on yet.
Put the camera on. I don't know where it is. Anyway, I had Peter come and say hello. Hi, Bill.
Hi.
Hi,
Hi.
Sonny.
Hi.
Oh,
Peter.
that's Bill. Hi, Bill.
How are you?
All
Great
right,
to see
so
you.
I better move on. Thank you for allowing us a moment to speak. We both were wrongly convicted and sentenced to death. Peter in Ireland, me in the US, and now we're married and happy. Anyway, so there are happy endings, thank God for us. So watching, first of all, so I'm going to take this to a personal level. I think it's important that it always be taken to a personal level. And I can do that because formerly my husband and I were, before Peter, my husband and I were wrongly sentenced to death in the US. And before we were able to prove our innocence, which took 17 years, my husband then, Jesse Tafaro, was executed, a botched execution. You've all heard of it. So I know from him, and I know from his friends, that watching your neighbors being taken out to be executed and then smelling their flesh burn for 3 days later is torture over and over again. Or the alternative of isolation, where you don't get to interact with anybody, is another form of torture, obviously. We agreed to LWOP, life without parole, as a group, the US anti-death penalty people, at one point, because we were told, we went around asking people in Texas especially, why are you for the death penalty? And they said, we aren't really for the death penalty, we just want to feel safe. Oh, so offer them life without parole, then they'll get rid of the death penalty, then they're at least they're alive, then we can get rid of life without parole. That was the idea. It may have been flawed, but that was the idea at the time. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been for that. And a lot of people left the anti-death penalty movement because of that. Basically, they just want to be sure that they wouldn't commit more crimes. Okay, so it was never meant to be permanent. Yep, you go ahead, Peter. And then I wanted to ask, what's the point of the death penalty? I think each culture has to answer that individually, because it's different in each culture. But in the US, it's revenge. That's the only thing that it serves, because safety can be achieved otherwise. So I don't think that the government or the judiciary or the citizens should be participating in somebody's revenge. I don't think it's a good reason. In the US, I unfortunately, sadly, I think that ultimately finances are going to determine the end of the death penalty, because that's what's happened state by state. It's just too expensive. And I think that it has to be a constitutional amendment, like Ireland. Yes, yes. I wouldn't even know you had a connection anymore, Bill. You sound so American. Anyway, that's where we met, in Ireland, at the Peace Center. And I do think that it has to be a constitutional amendment. Otherwise, like Brexit, I'm waiting. I'm just waiting for them to try to get the death penalty back in England again, because they're not because of Brexit. I'm just waiting. There'll be some horrible crime, and there's going to be a call for it again. And the other thing I would like to say is, I was glad you mentioned Kazakhstan, because Peter and I went there and we spoke to the prosecutors, and we like to think that we had something, maybe some small part in ending it there. And this has been, of the three, I got to say, this is the best discussion. This was really good. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sonny. Bill, did you want to say anything? Sorry.
Well, yeah, I'm thrilled. I didn't get to see Sonny because I've got the black screen on, and she didn't get the camera on. But
I
Sonny,
can't see. I know I can't find it.
Yeah, that's okay, Sonny. I know what you look like, but I'd love to see you, and I guess maybe I'll see you in Berlin at the next Death Penalty World Congress. But
Hope so.
to see you and Peter. But they're dear old friends of mine, of course, and we work together in Ireland on different things. I remember Sonny coming to speak to my master's students in Galway, and Peter, and there were some of those students who just left in tears. They were so moved by listening to you. It was very dramatic. You know, the one thing I don't think, Sonny, you should be so pessimistic about the UK. Rajiv also spoke about populism. Something that fascinated me is how the populist politicians actually don't make a big deal about the death penalty. It's out there. I don't want to say that they've forgotten about it. Trump, you know, did a little bit on the death penalty, but the populist politicians, if there's one thing they're good at, they know how to push people's buttons. That's how they operate. That's their whole thing. That's their shtick, is getting people excited. And they seem to sense, when you look at them, you add them all up, whether it's Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or something, they actually, they're uneasy about the death penalty. They don't push it very hard because they don't know, they're not confident that that actually works. And this is a very good sign. They know if they want to get people excited, they talk about migrants. That's how they do it. They know that really bothers people, and that's the way to get them worked up. But the death penalty, I think, you know, that's a train that's left the station. We're still living with it in some countries, but it's something I've watched in my lifetime. You know, when I was a boy, I grew up in Canada, and I can remember when I was about 12 or 13, there was a boy of 15 in Canada who was sentenced to death. And I remember reading about it, and I was just appalled. Now, they had a policy at the time in Canada already of not executing people under 18. So his sentence was automatically commuted. And several years later, it was demonstrated to be a wrongful conviction, and he received, you know, millions in compensation and everything, was freed. But for me, growing up with that, I sort of lived with that I had thought about that. And it was a boy who was close to my age who had been framed up finally and sentenced to death. But my kids never had that. And I have grandchildren now. For them, this is, in Canada, the death penalty is a medieval punishment that belongs to another era. It's over. And it's that way, I think, increasingly for other countries in the world. Not all of them, that's for sure. We're still, you know, we haven't won the battle, but we know the direction of travel. Absolutely. And I've been working on this issue for 30 years, and I keep hearing sort of the people who are more of the glasses half empty school of thought telling me, oh yeah, it's just temporary, just watch out, it's going to come back. But it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, I was heartbroken to see that Myanmar, they executed people last week. This is a terrible thing. This is a country that hadn't executed anybody since the 1980s. But it's quite anomalous. It's not generalized. And we know it's related to the fact that there's been a coup d'etat and there's a very repressive government and all of this. It doesn't change the general picture and the general, as I say, the direction of travel on the death penalty. So this is a battle, you know, we don't want to be complacent. We haven't won the battle, but we're winning it for sure. Yeah. And we shouldn't be, this idea that it's just on a knife edge, it's about to turn and flip and go back. I don't see it. I just don't see it. We thought, you know, when the September 11th happened in 2001, that should have been, it was the occasion for all kinds of repression, by the way. A lot of unlawful detention, Guantanamo, anti-terrorist measures everywhere, but it didn't bring back the death penalty. It didn't have that effect. So I think that you know, let's be positive. Sonny, yeah. Peter, I know you guys are positive at heart. You absolutely are.
Sonny and Peter, could I ask you a question?
Sure.
In theme with our topic tonight. So you both have got the word time in the titles of your both of your books. Why did you put that word in? What was important about it?
I always say I've had a strange relationship with time. Yeah, it's been my friend and my enemy. but I'm at peace with it now. I just have no concept of time anymore, except the weeks seem to go faster now. For some reason, I think as you get older, that happens though, normally. It was because there was a kind of a double entendre in the word time, stolen time, then it's about time, which it was about it, and also it's about time. And then the third book is Time After Time. And that hasn't come out yet, but
Right.
it is all about time. It's, time short, making your time short, or your time being long. The time incarcerated seems very long, and yet then when you get out, the time seems to go by very quickly. I was blessed, I guess, because I basically had no sense of time. So that was helpful, and I never put marks on the wall like they show in the movies, or kept track of the days like that, because that would just be, I thought, will that be just make things worse for myself? So I told time, which is in the book, I told time by the space in between meals. That was the only relevance time had to my life, was the short time between breakfast and lunch, another short time between lunch and dinner, and then the very long time between dinner and breakfast again. That's the only time that mattered to me. Then I got a hold of a watch. Oh my God, that was great, because then I could time the walks that I finally was granted after a year and a half. And I timed it to the minute. If they had me out for 59 minutes, I put down 1 minute in my book that they owed me. But that was the only relevance that time had. Otherwise, telling time while you're in prison, or especially sentenced to death, would be masochistic, really. But then when you're, like when you finally do have a court date, and then time becomes very relevant, or time when you have to file something becomes very, very relevant. So I've had, as I said, an odd relationship with time at various parts of my life. Now, I really don't count time anymore, except I noticed there's another Friday. I like to count Fridays. So, it's Friday again. But other than that, I have to look on my phone to see what day it is. And I like that. I like not being constrained by time anymore, or worrying about how much time I have left. So
Is Peter there?
Peter actually just went into the other room. I'm going to mute. I'm going to try to get him in the next 2 minutes, and then you can talk to him for a moment. Okay? Is that okay, or do we not have time?
Unfortunately, we've ran out of time. We've got 2 minutes perhaps, but if he's not there, perhaps we can ask him personally some other time. Margot, I see that the time is 1 minute past 7:30.
I'm afraid to say we do have to wrap, and there's the call of the dog to let us know it's time.
That's because I called Peter. He's coming.
You know what? We need more time on time, clearly. Sonny, did you want to say the last couple of words?
If Peter's there, or
Otherwise, I think we are.
Me? I'm sorry. Tell me what your question was, Barney. It's okay.
no, it was just going to the same question that I put to Sonny about Peter's title. Is it because it was the same answer be the one that you provided, or did he have different reasoning for putting time in his title?
I think he's on the way, but it might be too late. Where time has taken its toll on our speed as well. Speed and time go in opposite directions, and the slower you go, the faster time goes by somehow, and the faster you go, the slower time goes by.
Well, there is a solution, Sonny. We need to do another one of these, don't we? Perhaps we can get
yeah. Oh, here he comes. Here he comes. Peter,
answer on his behalf if you wanted.
Professor York has asked you a question. Okay, go ahead, Professor John York. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. We wanted to know why you use the word time in your title, and what did time mean to you under sentence of death, and what does it mean now?
Oh God. How much time have you got now?
A quick answer.
A quick answer. You
We
mean
do have to wrap.
in the book about time?
Yes. Why did you use the word time in the title?
Because the book was about time. It's not, it is actually about time. Time spent on the sentence of death, time spent in prison, time out of prison. Generally speaking, it's about time.
And what was the rest of your question, Professor?
No, that's, well, actually, Sonny, I think we need to do one of these, don't we, with you and Peter? We need to do an amicus on time death row with Sonny and Peter. So perhaps, and then we can think about these in more detail.
We can do that. I see a whole new series coming up. So I think we better wrap now because we are over time. But I just want to say a massive thank you to everybody who has participated. What an amazing panel. So everybody, I'm really, truly grateful for all of your contributions. And John, it's been a pleasure and a delight to host this series of webinars. And I know this will be the first series of many. So watch this space for more. And we'd better finish off now, though. But
Peter just wants to say one thing.
I just want to say something before we finish. Sonny's book is Stolen Time. My book is about time. And we're presently working on another book, which is going to be called Time After Time.
I told them.
You
Anyway.
did already? Okay, good.
Margot, you take over about books because those
and they are
so
all
Amicus.
available through the Amicus website as well. So in fact, I think that's the only place you can get Sonny's books. All editions are in my living room. So, shipping now. So thank you everybody for attending. Thanks for the wonderful questions. Do feel free to keep the conversation going on Twitter. I know that I think we've got everybody's handles, that's what it's called, on the Twitter feed. So I look forward to reading more discussions on there as well. So thank you again, everybody, and good night.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.